From the News Channel 5 Network, this is OpenLine.
Welcome to OpenLine, everyone. Good topic tonight. Lack of affordable housing is no doubt one of the major issues in Nashville and in Middle Tennessee. What do you think of this comment? Nashville leaders have pursued an urban growth strategy without adequate safeguards for affordable housing. We have with us tonight the person who wrote that in the Tennessean. We are happy to have with us TSU Assistant Professor Ken Chilton. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
I want to look at this, we've had politicians on who promise we're going to do everything we can and we're doing this and we're doing that. I want to look at it from an academic side.
Okay.
You know, let's analyze where we are. And that comment, Nashville leaders have pursued an urban growth strategy without adequate safeguards for affordable housing. What do you mean by that?
Good question. What I mean is most cities, it's not just a Nashville issue. My hometown of Louisville, Kentucky's done it. Chattanooga's done it. Most cities have done this kind of coming out of the 1970s and 80s with deindustrialization, trying to get people to move back to the cities after people moved out to the Williamson counties and the suburbs to get that tax revenue back. How do we make ourselves competitive and reinvent our cities? And part of that is stadiums, convention centers, hotels. So most cities have really dug into creating entertainment districts that eventually bled into, now we need people to move downtown or near downtown, and used a series of different incentive packages to kind of promote growth to the core. And because of that, not with a lot of forethought about affordable housing, because prior to about 2005, you didn't hear a lot of people in Nashville talking about this issue. And I think the assumption was that growth will create jobs. Those jobs and that income will trickle down to people. Everybody will be better off. And housing wasn't something that we really focused on. So I don't want to place the blame solely on previous leaders of Nashville, because they were doing what every other city, and we're competing. There's a lot of urban competition among cities for development dollars and investment dollars. And I can say, my hometown of Louisville, for instance, Nashville is doing a lot better in that regard of growing the local economy.
No doubt, we're the it city. And so when you look at the growth, that's where you would want to be.
Yes.
So when you hear that we've pursued a pro-growth strategy, it looks like it's working. We're growing like crazy. So on the other end of that would be, okay, we're not growing, and no one wants that.
Right.
So what are we supposed to do?
As I mentioned to a lot of my students, this is a good problem to have. You don't want to be Akron, where you're declining in population and your working class is slowly dying off, and you saw that play out in the last election with areas that are losing ground. The bad news about the new urban economy, though, is it creates a lot of hospitality jobs. Nothing wrong with working in the hospitality industry. It's creating a lot of innovation and tech jobs, but those don't pay the wages of the previous industrial economy. And as a result, you have a lot of people who need to work at these hotels and who need to work at these restaurants, but they're only paid $10, $12 an hour. They don't have good benefits, if any benefits. They don't have a pension. And as areas become more attractive to empty nesters and millennials who are willing to perhaps co-house to share costs and things like that, and as you know from looking at the data, there's been an influx. Nashville's one of the fastest growing cities for population, especially for millennials. That increased demand for a limited supply of housing drives up prices and other things as well. As Nashville became a market that's a hot market, it got the notice of investors locally and nationally who are now investing in the Nashville market, driving up prices.
So it's not just, when you say it brings in a lot of hospitality jobs, that's true, but it's not just people in the hospitality industry who can't afford housing in downtown. It's our police officers and our teachers and people who work here at this station.
Yes.
I mean, it's everyone.
Me.
The only, I mean, it's as if the only people who can afford to live in this area, it's quickly becoming, I don't know, lawyers, they're not your teachers and
right.
your people that, as I said, work in the jobs I just mentioned. So why is that a problem? What happens if all of those people have to move out, and we have a very wealthy group just in Davidson County.
Yeah, more like a European city where you have the people with money living in the core, and the suburbs become more the lower income folks. A couple of issues that come to mind. There's a disconnect between where workers live and where they work. How do you get people to work in the Cool Springs Mall area, for instance, for jobs that pay lower wages? How do you get people to the hotels if they don't live, which contributes to other problems like congestion and things of that nature? One of the changes over time in the gentrification literature has been, in the past there used to be a very critical literature. We academics were knee-jerk against gentrification, it's bad. And that's no longer the case. There's positives and there are negatives. And one of the positives is if you own a home in those neighborhoods and you can cash out, not necessarily a bad thing. If you're relocating from LA or New York and you sold a house there for $800,000, you can come down here and do quite well. But for people working in those industries that make this nightlife happen, that make this a dynamic place, the further they're away, the harder it is for them to experience the benefits of living in a dynamic place because they can't participate in it. And we focus on the exchange value of housing, the market prices, but there's something in the literature that we discuss called use value, the utility you derive from living in this neighborhood. And that is not always reflected in the price, but people like teachers add stability. I like it, for instance, when I go to my local Kroger and I see my son's teacher. That builds community and builds neighborhood. And if it's people who we depend on and are the backbone of our local community can't live with us, I think that there's a great book written 15 years ago, The Great Sort, that we've sorted out based upon our kind of tribal affiliations. This neighborhood is young gentrifying folks, and this neighborhood is white-haired retirees with money, and this is low-income Hispanics. We've almost kind of created neighborhoods based upon class, and that there's social repercussions to that are playing out in Nashville.
Is that new, though? I mean, hasn't it always been that way?
No, I don't think it has always been that way. And it's interesting, when I was preparing for this, my father passed away many years ago. We went through his goods and his things, and I found in 1970 his salary information and the amount that he spent on our house. And he made the equivalent as a GED doing skilled labor of the equivalent in today's dollars of about $75,000, had 5 kids, his wife stayed at home, and he bought a house for the equivalent of $112,000. That spread between salary and ratio, that ratio between salary and housing affordability has really spread 3, 4, 5 times, and that again leads to communities that are concentrated with poverty. In Nashville, we got about 40, 50,000 people living in neighborhoods or census tracts that are gentrifying, and that's a lot of people. But we have about 175,000 people living in low to moderate income areas. And we know when you concentrate low and moderate income people together, there's impacts on schools and school quality. There's impact on crime and violence. Creates a lot of ripple effects beyond just the housing market.
And you wrote, what is happening in Nashville is a combination of government and market failure. So, yes. I mean, when I hear what's happening, I think, well, you know, it's just kind of a natural evolution. Mm-hmm. We're growing, and I don't know what government can really do. It's the market that's doing this. What can government do about this? Good question. Historically, the federal government was very involved in housing markets. If you think back to urban renewal, federal housing projects, building housing for poor people, building interstates, which destroyed a lot of neighborhoods, especially for poor people. The federal government played a very strong role in dominating local housing markets. Starting in the late 70s and the early 80s, we started taking a more market-based approach to housing. We give people Section 8 vouchers. We get out of the markets and let the interplay of supply and demand happen, and people locate where they want and they vote with their feet. As a result, we haven't built a lot of low-income housing, and the more affordable housing or workforce type housing that we build tends to go further out where land costs are lower. And you see that in Rutherford County. Anybody who sits on I-24 can tell you all about that story.
So there's been that change, and what can government do about it? Like I said, they've kind of taken a hands-off approach when it comes to housing. If I was going to predict things, and I don't like predicting things, but I don't see this federal regime's HUD doing much in terms of building more affordable housing, more market-oriented approaches. But at the local level, what can we do? There are things like inclusionary zoning that the city council and the mayor made happen, and the state legislature nullified that. In terms of things that could perhaps spark higher wages, the city of Seattle passed legislation raising the minimum wage in Seattle to $15 an hour. If city council wanted to do that, that probably would be nullified in Tennessee. So there's a limited number of arrows in local government's quiver in terms of being able to do much to slow it down or to stop it.
And I've heard developers say something like rent control never works. That if you look at cities where there is the worst amount of affordable housing, I think they point to San Francisco.
Yes.
They had something like that, and you can't afford to live there at all.
Yes.
And so again, they would argue when government gets involved, it only makes things worse.
And there's another group of planners who argue that through zoning regulations and all the requirements that developers have to go to, that increases the price of housing, which further makes this is the problem of housing affordability. I don't know if the literature proves that or not, because there are communities that have less restrictive regulations, places like Houston, where housing is quite expensive as well in certain neighborhoods. But locally, I mean, now we have at least voluntary inclusionary zoning, which means you want to build 40 units in this neighborhood. I'm going to give you a density bonus. You can build 50, but we need to make 10% of those affordable. We can do voluntary community agreements where a neighborhood group can work with local government, the planning department, to kind of build in some requirements. You want to build this, expand the, or build this hotel that's going to affect our neighborhood and affect our parking and affect our housing values. We want you to pitch in money to help offset the costs. Maybe we can direct some of that money to affordable housing. The city of Nashville has their housing affordability fund, which they've put $10 million in. That's a great start. In a perfect world, you'd like to see that sustainable, a line item that grows over time, but giving funding realities, I don't know if that's possible or not, but it's a great start.
So, all right, we have to take a break.
Sure.
And that kind of sets the table. If you want to join in the conversation, there's the number, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. We come back and there's a lot to talk about. I want to talk about speculators and that kind of thing.
Great.
We'll come back, take a break, be back right after this.